In the clear blue skies over Bavaria in 1943, a sound was heard that had never been heard before in the history of human conflict. It wasn't the roar of a piston engine or the chop of propeller. It was a high-pitched scream, a banshee wail that signaled the arrival of a new age. Germany possessed a weapon so advanced it rendered every Allied aircraft instantly obsolete. It was a strategic ace in the hole that could have swept the American bomber streams from the sky and secured the airspace over the Reich. Yet, this miracle machine would spend its most critical months grounded, not by enemy fire, but by a command from the very top. If you want to uncover the technological tragedies that define the end of the war, make sure to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive. To understand the magnitude of this failure, we have to go back to a sunny morning at the Lechfeld airfield in May 1943. Adolf Galland, the general of the fighter arm and Germany's most charismatic ace, climbed into the cockpit of a strange, shark-like aircraft. It had no propeller. Instead, two massive pods hung under its swept-back wings. This was the Messerschmitt Me 262. Galland was a skeptic. He loved the raw, mechanical feel of his Messerschmitt Bf 109. But as he pushed the throttles forward and the Junker's Jumbo turbojet engines ignited, his skepticism vanished. The acceleration pressed him back into his seat with a force he had never experienced. He tore down the runway and climbed into the sky at a speed that defied belief. He was flying at 540 miles per hour, over 100 miles per hour faster than the best American Mustang or British Spitfire. When he landed, breathless and exhilarated, he famously reported to his superiors, "It felt as if angels were pushing." Galland immediately grasped the strategic implication. The Allied bombing campaign was strangling Germany. The Americans bombed by day, the British by night. The Luftwaffe's piston fighters were struggling to pierce the massive formations of B-17 flying fortresses, which were protected by swarms of escort fighters. But the Me-262 changed the math. It was too fast for the escorts to catch. It could slash through the bomber formations, unleash a devastating barrage of 30mm cannon fire, and vanish before the American gunners could track it. Galland calculated that a single wing of these jets, perhaps 100 aircraft, could inflict such unsustainable losses on the U.S. 8th Air Force that the bombing raids would have to stop. The engineers at Messerschmitt had performed a miracle. Despite the shortages of rare metals like chromium and nickel, forcing them to build engines that were temperamental and prone to catching fire, they had delivered a functioning jet fighter years ahead of the Allies. The British Gloucester Meteor was still in development and lacked the combat performance of the 262. The Americans had nothing even close. Germany had the lead. They had the technology. They had the pilots. All they needed was the order to mass-produce the aircraft as a fighter interceptor immediately. The plan was clear. Build thousands of them, train the best pilots to fly them, and create a shield of jet over the fatherland. It was Germany's last real chance to regain air superiority, which was a prerequisite for holding back the inevitable Allied invasion of France. But in the fevered atmosphere of the Third Reich, logic often took a back seat to ideology. While Galland was dreaming of air defense, Adolf Hitler was dreaming of vengeance. The dictator was under immense pressure. The German cities were burning. The U-boat war in the Atlantic was lost. He needed a way to strike back at Britain, to inflict pain on the Allies that would break their morale. He didn't care about shooting down bombers. That was a defensive measure, and Hitler detested defense. He wanted to attack. He wanted a Blitzbomber, a lightning-fast bomber that could slip through the Allied radar along the English coast and drop bombs on London or the invasion ports with impunity. This fundamental disconnect between the military reality, the need for defense, and the political desire, the need for offense, set the stage for a collision. The Me-262 was designed as a purebred hunter. It was a delicate, high-speed interceptor. It was not a truck designed to haul heavy iron bombs. But nobody had told Hitler that. As the summer of 1943 turned to autumn, the Me-262 program moved forward, but shadow hung over it. The production lines were being readied. The pilots were eager. But the final Führer order defining the role of the aircraft had not yet been signed. The engineers assumed it would be a fighter. The generals assumed it would be a fighter. But in a remote conference room, a misunderstanding was brewing that would clip the wings of the angels before they could even fight. The most dangerous moments in history often occur not on the battlefield amidst the roar of cannons, but in quiet rooms where a single sentence can change the fate of millions. In November 1943, at the Insterburg airfield in East Prussia, such a moment occurred, a conversation between a dictator and an aircraft designer that would doom the Luftwaffe. Before we analyze this catastrophic error, hit that like button to support our channel's mission to document history's turning points. The occasion was a demonstration of Germany's newest weaponry. Adolf Hitler, looking aged and stooped, walked down the line of prototype aircraft. He stopped in front of the Me 262. Its sleek lines and predatory stance seemed to mesmerize him. He turned to Willy Messerschmitt, the legendary designer, and Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe. Hitler asked a simple, loaded question. Can this aircraft carry bombs? This was a trap. From an engineering standpoint, the answer was technically yes. You could bolt bomb racks onto almost anything that flew. Messerschmitt, eager to please the Führer and secure funding for his company, replied, Yes, my Führer. It can carry two 250-kilogram bombs effectively. He did not mention that adding the drag of bombs would ruin the jet's aerodynamics. He didn't mention that the extra weight would make the already long takeoff run dangerously longer. He didn't mention that the plane had no bomb sight and no dive brakes suitable for precision bombing. He just said, yes. Hitler's eyes lit up. In that moment, he didn't see an interceptor that could save German industry. He saw his Blitzbomber. He exclaimed, At last! This is the Blitzbomber I have been demanding for years. No one can stop this machine. Then he dropped the hammer. He issued a verbal order that would become law. The Me 262 was to be produced exclusively as a fast bomber. He explicitly forbade referring to it as a fighter. He declared that anyone who thought of it as a defensive weapon was thinking like a defeatist. When General Galland heard the news, he was devastated. He tried to argue. He went to Göring, pleading that the Luftwaffe was bleeding to death and needed protection, not a fast bomber that could drop a paltry 500 kilos of explosives. But Göring, terrified of Hitler's wrath, refused to challenge the order. He told Galland, The Führer wants a bomber. He will have a bomber. The consequences of this decision were immediate and chaotic. The production lines, which were tooling up to build fighters, had to be halted and redesigned. The engineers had to figure out how to attach bomb mechanisms to a high-speed jet without ripping the wings off. They had to move the center of gravity. They had to design a fuel transfer system to balance the load. All of this took time. Precious, irreplaceable time. The fighter variant was ready to go into mass production in early 1944. The bomber conversion delayed the program by months. This period is known to historians as the lost year, while German engineers were struggling to ruin a perfect fighter by turning it into a mediocre bomber. The air war over Europe reached its climax. In early 1944, the Americans launched Big Week, a massive, concentrated assault on the German aircraft industry. Thousands of Mustangs and Thunderbolts swept over Germany, hunting down the Luftwaffe's piston fighters. The German pilots, flying outdated Bf-109s and Fw-190s, fought bravely, but they were overwhelmed. They were trading lives at a ratio they couldn't sustain. The experienced experts were killed one by one, replaced by green teenagers with barely any flight training. Galland watched his force disintegrate with rage in his heart. He knew that if he had the jets, even just a few dozen of them operating as fighters, he could have broken up the American formations. The sheer psychological terror of a jet attack would have forced the bombers to abort their missions. But the jets were sitting in hangars, undergoing modification, or they were being delivered to bomber units that had no idea how to fly them. The bomber pilots, trained to fly steady and level in Heinkels and Junkers, were terrified of the jet speed. They crashed them on takeoff. They crashed them on landing. They flew them straight and level, making them easy targets for Allied fighters diving from above. The strategic advantage was being squandered. Hitler believed that a handful of jet bombers disrupting the Allied invasion beaches would be more valuable than shooting down thousands of heavy bombers over Germany. It was a delusion born of his obsession with offensive action. He viewed the air war as a tit-for-tat exchange of blows, failing to realize that if the roof is burning down, you don't run outside to throw a stone at the arsonist. You put out the fire. The Me 262 was a fire extinguisher, and Hitler was trying to use it as a grenade. By the spring of 1944, the invasion of Europe was imminent. The Allies were massing in southern England. The German army in France waited behind the Atlantic Wall, knowing that if the Allied air forces controlled the sky, any movement on the ground would be suicide. The Me 262 was their only hope of contesting that control. But thanks to the Blitzbomber order, the hope was hollow. If you're enjoying this historical breakdown, please subscribe. We're building a library of history's most critical lessons. When D-Day arrived on June 6, 1944, the Luftwaffe was nowhere to be seen. The Allies flew over 14,000 sorties on that single day. The Luftwaffe managed a few hundred. The sky belonged to the invasion fleet. Where were the jets? A handful of Me-262s converted into bombers were technically operational, but they were completely ineffective, flying high and fast to avoid interception. The pilots couldn't see their targets through the clouds or the smoke of battle. They dropped their bombs blindly into the chaos of the Normandy beachhead. They hit nothing of significance. They were mosquito bites on the hide of an elephant. Had those same aircraft been configured as fighters and flown by aces like Galland, Steinhoff, or Nowotny, the story might have been different. They could have torn through the slow-flying formations of C, 47 transport planes carrying paratroopers. They could have attacked the spotter planes directing naval gunfire. They could have forced the Allied fighter-bombers to drop their bombs early and engage in air combat, relieving the pressure on the German tanks below. But the order stood. Bombers only. The frustration within the Luftwaffe reached a boiling point. General Erhard Milch, responsible for aircraft production, had secretly tried to continue fighter production on the side. When Hitler found out, he was apoplectic. He threatened to execute anyone who disobeyed his orders regarding the jet. It wasn't until late 1944, when the German armies were retreating across France and the borders of the Reich were breached, that Hitler finally, grudgingly, relented. He allowed the formation of the first experimental jet fighter unit, Kommando Nowotny, led by the famous Austrian ace Walter Nowotny. It was a case of too little, too late. The unit was thrown into combat before the tactics were developed. The pilots were learning how to fight in a jet while being shot at by hundreds of Mustangs. They discovered that while the jet was fast in the air, it was incredibly vulnerable on the ground. It needed long concrete runways. The Allies, realizing the threat, quickly adapted. They didn't try to dogfight the jets at 30,000 feet. Instead, they hovered over the German airfields. They waited for the jets to take off or land. When the Me-262 was low and slow, with its engine spooling up, it was a sitting duck. Nowotny himself was killed in November 1944, shot down as he approached his airfield. His death was a symbolic blow. The great hope of the Luftwaffe was burning in a crater, not ruling the sky. Meanwhile, the strategic bombing of Germany intensified. The oil refineries were destroyed. The synthetic fuel plants were hammered. This created a vicious cycle. The jets needed a special fuel, J2, derived from diesel. As fuel became scarce, the jets couldn't fly. When they couldn't fly, they couldn't protect the fuel plants. Galland, now desperate, devised a plan called the Great Blow der Großschlag. He hoarded the remaining fighters. He pulled the best pilots from the front lines. His idea was to launch massive formation of thousands of fighters, including every available jet, against a single American bomber stream. He wanted to shoot down 400 or 500 bombers in one day, shocking the Allies into pausing the air war. But he was constantly undermined. Every time he gathered a reserve of fighters, they were stripped away to support the hopeless ground offensives, like the Battle of the Bulge. The jets were wasted on strafing runs against trucks and infantry, a job that could have been done by cheap propeller planes. Using a technological marvel like the Me-262 to strafe a jeep was like using a diamond to hammer a nail. It was a waste of resources that Germany simply didn't have. As 1945 dawned, the Third Reich was collapsing. The Russians were on the Oder. The Americans were on the Rhine. In this apocalypse, the tragedy of the Me-262 entered its final, rebellious phase. The pilots, the experts, decided they'd had enough of incompetence. They would fight their own war their way in a final act of defiance. Before we witness the fighter revolt, verify that you are subscribed. You won't want to miss the finale of the saga. The relationship between Hermann Göring and his fighter pilots had deteriorated into open hatred. Göring blamed the pilots for the destruction of German cities. He called them cowards. He threatened to court-martial them. He stripped Galland of his command, effectively firing the most capable leader the Luftwaffe had. This triggered the fighter pilots' revolt. A group of the most decorated aces in history, men like Gunther Lutzow and Johannes Steinhoff, who had thousands of aerial victories between them, confronted Göring in a tense meeting. They demanded that Galland be reinstated and that the Me-262 be used exclusively as a fighter. Göring was furious. He threatened to have them all shot for mutiny. But he couldn't. These men were national heroes. Their faces were on postcards. So he exiled them. But in a strange twist of fate, as the end drew near, Hitler allowed Galland to form his own private unit. It was called JV-44, Jaguar Band 44. It was perhaps the most elite squadron in the history of aviation. It was said that the Knight's Cross was the badge of the squadron, because almost every pilot had one. Galland recruited the exiled aces. They painted the undersides of their jets in red and white stripes, so the German anti-aircraft gunners wouldn't shoot them down by mistake. Operating from makeshift airfields in Bavaria, JV-44 showed the world what might have been. Free from the Blitzbomber orders, flying the jets as pure interceptors, they wreaked havoc on the American bomber formations in the final weeks of the war. Using the R-4M air-to-air rockets, they developed a new tactic. They would climb high above the bombers, dive at supersonic speeds, and fire a salvo of rockets into formation. A single hit would disintegrate A-B-17. Then they would climb away, untouchable. In March and April 1945, the skies over southern Germany were filled with parachutes. The Americans were stunned. After years of grinding the Luftwaffe down, suddenly there were tigers in the sky again. In one engagement, a handful of jets shot down massive numbers of bombers without loss. But it was a phantom victory. They were fighting over the burning ruins of their own country. They would land their jets and have to tow them into the trees with oxen because there was no fuel for the towing tractors. They were taking off while American tanks were shelling the other end of the runway. The great blow never happened. The shield of jet never materialized. JV-44 was a gladiator show, spectacular, heroic, and completely pointless in the grand scheme of the war. They were proving a point, that the machine was superior and the men were willing. But the strategy had failed them years ago. The infrastructure to support the jets had been destroyed. The engines, which needed overhaul every 10 hours, were failing. The pilots were exhausted. And the leadership, Hitler and Göring, were hiding in bunkers, disconnected from the reality of the air war. The story of Me-262 ends not with a bang, but with a bonfire. In May 1945, as American troops rolled onto the airfield of JV-44, the pilots made their final decision. They would not let their birds be taken as trophies. If you want to see how the legacy of these jets lives on today, subscribe now for our upcoming episode on the Cold War aviation race. Galland, injured in his final dogfight, watched from the ground. His men poured gasoline over the sleek, shark-like fuselages of the Me-262s. They fired flare pistols into the cockpits. The Angels burned. When the American intelligence officers arrived, they found charred skeletons of the most advanced aircraft in the world. But they also found intact examples at other airfields, hidden in forests and on assembly lines in underground caves. The race for the technology began immediately. The Americans and Soviets grabbed every jet, every engine, and every blueprint they could find. They kidnapped the engineers. The swept-wing design of the Me-262 became the DNA for the American F-86 Sabre and the Soviet MiG-15. The strategic advantage that Germany had forfeited became the foundation of the Cold War air forces. So, why did the decision to make it a bomber destroy Germany's last hope? It wasn't that the Me-262 would have won the war. By 1944, Germany was overwhelmed by numbers, resources, and enemies on all sides. Even with 1,000 jets, they likely couldn't have stopped the Red Army on the ground or the atomic bomb that was being developed in America. The defeat was inevitable. However, the decision destroyed the strategic advantage. It took a weapon that could have fundamentally altered the cost of the war for the Allies, making the bombing campaign too expensive to sustain, and turned it into a footnote. It was the ultimate example of the Nazi regime's flaw, the belief that willpower and aggressive ideology could overcome physics and logistics. Hitler's obsession with the counterstrike, with a vengeance weapon, blinded him to the one thing that might have bought his regime more time: defense. He wanted a hammer, so he ruined a shield. The tragedy of the Me-262 is the tragedy of the German military in microcosm, tactical brilliance betrayed by strategic incompetence. The engineers built the future, and the dictator tried to use it to fight the battles of the past. Today, looking at the Me-262 in a museum, it doesn't look like a relic of 1944. It looks modern. It looks like it belongs in the sky. It stands as a silent testament to the terrifying potential of human ingenuity and the saving grace of human error. The decision to delay the fighter saved countless Allied airmen's lives and shortened the war in Europe. And for that, the world can be thankful for the Blitzbomber mistake. Thank you for watching this series. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the technology of World War II, click the video on the screen to learn about the V-2 rocket and why it was the most expensive failure of the war. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share.